Throughout my journeys across the UK, I've encountered many places that were influenced by Shakespeare, as well as areas that played a part during the outbreaks of the plague. And now we shall take a look at how the plague influenced the UK and especially how it influenced art. As most people know, the bubonic plague was a disease spread from fleas carried by rats from trade ships. People would be bitten by the fleas and infected. The armpits would swell with buboes. The victims would later break out in a rash and their energy would drain. Fever would strike, affecting their mind and motor skills. Their glands would swell, causing purple swollen spots. A sneezing fit came right before their death. In a matter of days, the victim would die. The disease spread in part to the abysmal living conditions in England, especially the conditions of the poor. The filth of the streets helped breed the rats that would later carry the fleas that would bring their death. Now, this is not a report solely on the plague, so let's get to the theater part. For this project, Shakespeare will be the focus of the plague because, well, we took a Shakespeare class. During our visit, we saw many areas that were influenced by Shakespeare and the Black Death. To begin, we saw Shakespeare's birthplace. Little Will was very lucky. He was born during a particularly bad outbreak of the plague and was lucky enough to be the first Shakespeare child to live. During his life, his parents would take the family to the Arden farm whenever the disease reared its head. This was a very wise move on his parents' behalf, because moving out to the countryside was one of the best ways to protect yourself. When Shakespeare was in his 20s, he moved to London and worked as an actor and a dramatist, becoming relatively well established by 28. However, throughout Shakespeare's career, there would be many obstacles to overcome. Any look at an Elizabethan theater timeline or peek in Will of the World will show you the closures and pressure from churches, not to mention fires, a common theme when it comes to theaters in London. When all these things are considered, it's amazing to think of how Shakespeare's work is still alive today. Now, the inhabitants of England back in the day didn't really have a good grasp on how the plague spread. As Will in the World explains, they considered it an airborne disease, or one spread by dogs and cats, causing them to kill the dogs and cats, which only escalated the problem. They did, however, realize that quarantines worked really well for controlling the spread of the disease. They did this by not allowing people to go in and out of the city without a permit. Some cities, such as Edinburgh, would send plague victims to a place, in their case the Meadows, where they would stay for 6 weeks. If they lived, they could come back, but if not, they were buried. So another way was closures. Things had to close, and because there was no way the authorities were going to close down churches, theater became a target of public closures. So every so often when the plague came around, theaters would close down. Entire theater seasons would go by without a play in sight due to the severity of the plague. 1603 was a particularly bad year for London, as well as 1593. As Elizabethan theater timeline handout, we received states. Of course, it's obvious that artists were able to push through these hard times, especially the works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and the contribution of the Burbages and Lord Chamberlain's men. These groups, as well as others, were able to combat the plague and the disputes over who owns the land and who owns the theater, and fires, including a fire at the Globe in 1614. Even after Shakespeare's death, theater had a hard time keeping alive. During our tours, multiple times we were told about the Puritans closing down all the theaters, as well as the suppression of other fun things. And yet, we were able to live on, theater was able to live on after 20 years. It's truly amazing how theater was able to live past all of this. The death and disease caused by the plague, fires in the theaters, and closures due to religious parties. Not to mention the gap between Shakespeare's death and the production of the First Folio. And yet, through all this, the power of theater lived on. Here in the year 2013, we saw 4 of Shakespeare's work, including one in the Rose Theatre, one in the Globe, one in Shakespeare's hometown. We witnessed the house Shakespeare retreated to in his childhood during times of plague, drove over the streets where plague victims would have been quarantined and buried. But still, we were able to experience the stories and magic of the plays Shakespeare produced during such a dark time. Thank you.